There's a quiet belief many people carry without ever fully questioning it, that feeling immobile in life means something has gone wrong. The word most often used is stuck, as if progress has failed, motivation has dried up, or discipline has weakened. Yet when this state is examined more closely, it rarely resembles indifference or collapse. It feels tighter than that, more deliberate, less like giving up and more like holding on. What is often labeled as stagnation has a particular quality to it. Life may continue to function on the surface. Responsibilities are met. Routines remain intact. There is order, even competence. But beneath that order sits a persistent sense of compression, as though movement has been reduced to the minimum required to endure. This is not the stillness of peace. It is the stillness of restraint. Survival mode does not announce itself with drama. It does not always involve panic, chaos, or visible distress. More often, it looks controlled, efficient, responsible. It narrows life quietly, trimming away risk, desire, and emotional exposure until only what feels manageable remains. In environments that have been unpredictable, demanding, or emotionally unsafe, the psyche does not break. It conserves. Energy is redirected toward stability. Identity contracts around what is necessary to remain intact. Marcus Aurelius warned against confusing endurance with vitality. Endurance, he understood, can preserve life during difficult seasons. It can keep a person standing when circumstances are harsh. But endurance alone is not the same as living. When it becomes a permanent state rather than a temporary response, it limits growth without ever announcing that it has done so. This is where the illusion forms. The individual begins to believe they are failing, when in reality a system designed to protect them is still operating long after the original threat has passed. Nothing appears obviously wrong, yet something feels quietly constrained. The question, then, is not why movement has stopped, but what is being protected by that stillness. Perhaps the sense of being stuck is not evidence of weakness or lack of will. Perhaps it is evidence of an internal structure that once served a purpose and has not yet been asked whether it is still needed. Survival mode is often misunderstood because it is described as a mindset, a habit of thought that could be changed if only someone tried harder. Yet long before the mind forms explanations, the body has already learned a lesson. The nervous system does not wait for language. It responds directly to experience, especially when experience involves threat without escape. When expression leads to rejection, when honesty results in loss, or when movement brings punishment rather than relief, the body adapts. Not by collapsing, but by conserving. In situations where fighting feels dangerous and fleeing feels impossible, the system selects a third response: stillness. This freeze response is not passive, is highly organized. Energy is contained. Emotion is dampened. Initiative is restrained. The body learns that remaining quiet and predictable reduces harm. Over time, this state begins to feel familiar. Calm no longer registers as safety, but as exposure. Silence feels more reliable than connection. Neutrality feels safer than desire. Many people notice that even when external danger has passed, their body continues to behave as if it has not. They are not choosing this consciously. The nervous system is replaying a solution that once worked. Carl Jung observed that experiences left unintegrated do not fade with time. They continue to operate beneath awareness, shaping perception and behavior. Survival responses are no exception. When freeze becomes chronic, it no longer feels like a response at all. It feels like character. Emotional distance is reinterpreted as independence. Numbness is mistaken for balance. Withdrawal begins to look like maturity. At this point, the individual may stop recognizing the original function of the response. They do not think of themselves as protecting anything. They simply believe this is who they are. This is how survival becomes identity, not through choice, but through repetition without reflection. Understanding this changes the tone of the conversation entirely. If survival mode is held in the body rather than the will, self-criticism loses its usefulness. Logic alone cannot persuade the nervous system that it is safe. Awareness must come first. Recognition must precede change. Only when the freeze response is seen clearly, without judgment, does the possibility of release begin to emerge. What once preserved life may no longer be required to live it. Survival mode has a quiet talent for disguising itself as virtue. Few disguises are more convincing than discipline. Structure, self-reliance, and emotional restraint are widely praised, often held up as signs of maturity or strength. From the outside, the individual appears stable, composed, even admirable. Life functions. Tasks are completed. There is order. Yet beneath that order, something feels increasingly narrow. Discipline, in this state, no longer feels like a choice. It feels compulsory. Routines are followed not because they nourish, but because deviation feels dangerous. Control becomes a form of reassurance. Predictability becomes a shield. What once began as self-respect slowly turns into self-containment, a tightening of life around what feels manageable. Seneca was deeply aware of this tension. He warned that restraint, when separated from reflection, can become another form of captivity. Discipline that emerges from fear does not cultivate freedom. It enforces compliance. In survival mode, discipline is not guided by clarity or purpose, but by the quiet aim of preventing disruption. Emotional expression is monitored. Desire is postponed. Rest is treated as something to be earned rather than allowed. Over time, this creates a particular kind of exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of effort, but the exhaustion of constant regulation. Many people notice they have become efficient but distant, capable yet oddly disengaged from their own lives. They function well, but feel little vitality in what they are doing. Even pleasure can feel suspicious, as though ease might invite loss of control. This is where the distinction becomes crucial. Discipline rooted in self-respect expands life. It creates space for focus, integrity, and meaningful action. Discipline rooted in survival restricts life. It narrows options, limits emotional range, and slowly erodes spontaneity. Both may look identical on the surface. Internally, they feel entirely different. Recognizing this does not require rebellion or collapse. It does not ask for abandonment of structure. It asks for honesty. When discipline is examined carefully, its underlying motive becomes visible. And once that motive is seen, discipline can be reclaimed, not as a mechanism of containment, but as a conscious alignment with what genuinely matters. In that shift, control gives way to clarity, and structure begins to serve life rather than limit it. What begins as adaptation rarely announces where it's heading. In survival mode, the psyche learns quickly which versions of the self are safest to present to the world. Reliability is rewarded. Calm is praised. Competence is reinforced. Slowly, roles form around what keeps life predictable. The individual does not wear these roles to deceive others. They wear them to reduce risk. Over time, these roles become familiar. They begin to feel natural. Many people notice they are known as the stable one, the capable one, the person who never causes trouble. This identity brings a certain security. Expectations are clear. Reactions are manageable. Yet something subtle happens beneath the surface. The role is no longer something one performs. It becomes something one inhabits. Carl Jung described this process as over-identification with the persona, the socially acceptable face presented to the world. The persona itself is not the problem. It allows life to function. It enables cooperation, work, and social belonging. The danger appears when the individual forgets that this face is partial. When function replaces identity, access to spontaneity, vulnerability, and emotional depth quietly diminishes. Silence begins to substitute for authenticity. Control takes the place of curiosity. Life narrows toward what can be managed without exposure. The longer this continues, the more unfamiliar the unmasked self becomes. Many people sense this distance without knowing how to name it. They feel strangely absent from their own lives, even while appearing fully present to others. Nietzsche warned that false forms of morality often arise from fear rather than truth. When strength is defined as emotional invulnerability, survival strategies are elevated into virtues. Composure becomes righteousness. Self-denial becomes discipline. Yet what is suppressed does not disappear. It accumulates. Beneath composure, pressure builds. Beneath stability, something restless waits. This pressure is not an enemy. It is information. It signals that an internal balance has been held too tightly for too long. The mask that once protected is now constraining what it was meant to preserve. Recognizing this does not require dismantling one's life or rejecting the role entirely. It restores something quieter but essential: choice. What once served survival may no longer serve wholeness. And seeing that difference, without judgment or urgency, opens the possibility of returning to parts of the self that were never lost, only hidden for safety. There often comes a moment when the strategies that once held life together begin to lose their effect. The routines remain in place. Responsibilities are still met. From the outside, little appears to have changed. Yet internally, the relief those structures once provided starts to fade. Restlessness surfaces without a clear cause. Fatigue deepens even after rest. Emotional responses appear unexpectedly, detached from any obvious story. This phase is frequently misread as failure. It can feel like a personal regression, as though stability has been lost. But what is unfolding is rarely a breakdown in the usual sense. It is more accurately a transition. Viktor Frankl observed that suffering becomes transformative only when meaning remains possible. When survival mode has completed its task, the psyche begins to signal that continuation without change is no longer sustainable. What feels like collapse may, in fact, be thawing. Systems that have been frozen for a long time resist movement until holding still becomes more painful than allowing change. The body does not initiate release to punish the individual. It does so to restore balance. Tears arrive without warning. Exhaustion deepens. Emotional waves move through without explanation. These experiences are not regressions. They are signs that containment has reached its limit. Many people notice that what once kept them functional now feels heavy. The habits that protected them begin to constrict. The composure that once brought control now demands constant effort. It becomes clear, often slowly, that survival no longer matches the present reality. The danger that shaped these responses has passed, but the responses themselves remain. This moment does not require immediate action or dramatic change. Forcing transformation only replicates the same control that created the impasse. What is required instead is recognition. Awareness emerges gradually, often through discomfort rather than clarity. It is no longer about returning to previous levels of functioning. It becomes quieter and more precise. What no longer fits? What is being held together that no longer needs to be? This threshold marks a significant psychological passage, not a solution, and not yet a new identity, simply an opening. And openings rarely arrive with comfort. They arrive with uncertainty. But it is through these openings that life regains movement, not by erasing what came before, but by allowing it to loosen its grip. When survival stops working, it is often because living is beginning to ask for more room. Freedom is often imagined as relief, as ease, as the absence of constraint. Yet this understanding rarely holds up under closer examination. Epictetus saw this clearly. For him, freedom did not begin when circumstances became favorable, but when responsibility was reclaimed, not for what had happened, but for how one now chooses to relate to it. Survival mode limits choice in order to preserve life. It narrows attention, reduces options, and prioritizes safety over truth. This is not a moral failure. It is a functional response. But awakening begins when choice slowly returns. And with choice comes responsibility. Not blame, not self-judgment. Responsibility in this sense is quieter. It is the recognition that while certain responses were once necessary, continuing them indefinitely is no longer automatic. It becomes something that can be noticed. Many people misunderstand responsibility as harshness toward the self. But here it functions differently. It is not about condemning past adaptations. It is about acknowledging present agency. Often it appears as a subtle shift in awareness, a moment of noticing the urge to withdraw rather than obeying it, a pause before reverting to control, a recognition that an old response has been activated, even if it is not yet released. Inner freedom does not demand dramatic confrontation. It asks for steady attention. Emotions that were once frozen begin to register. Desires long postponed surface without urgency. Truths that once felt dangerous are allowed to exist without being acted upon immediately. Responsibility becomes the capacity to stay present with what arises, rather than escaping into habit. Nietzsche described this process as self-overcoming, not as domination, but as integration. Survival fragments identity by isolating certain parts of experience in the name of safety. Responsibility begins to reunite those parts. Protective instincts are not discarded. They are repositioned. What once acted automatically becomes discernment. What once enforced control becomes clarity. This is the stage where movement quietly returns. Not as impulse and not as rebellion, but as intention. Life begins to feel less reactive and more responsive. The individual is no longer governed entirely by what once kept them alive. They're beginning to participate in how they live. Freedom, in this sense, does not arrive suddenly. It emerges gradually through the simple but demanding act of taking responsibility for awareness itself. And in that awareness, something shifts. Survival loosens its grip. Choice re-enters, and with it, the possibility of a life shaped not by fear, but by understanding. The final stage is not a resolution, and it does not arrive with clarity all at once. It is better described as an orientation. Survival mode rarely ends through a decisive moment. It loosens gradually as trust returns in small, almost imperceptible ways. The individual learns to remain present without armor, to tolerate openness without collapse. What emerges is not a dramatic rebirth, but a quiet return. Many people expect healing to feel conclusive, as though a chapter has closed for good. Yet what often appears instead is a new relationship with what once governed them. Survival no longer commands from the shadows. It is seen, and when it is seen clearly, it loses its unconscious authority. Marcus Aurelius understood this when he wrote about clarity as a form of dignity. To perceive one's inner state without distortion is already an act of freedom. As awareness expands, the nervous system begins to recalibrate, not because danger has disappeared, but because it is no longer the only reference point. Stillness no longer signals threat. It becomes a choice. Discipline no longer functions as containment. It becomes alignment. Structure remains, but it serves presence rather than fear. Healing here does not mean erasing the past. It means relating to it differently. What was once carried in silence is now allowed to exist without dominating the present. The body is no longer forced into constant vigilance. It is invited into responsiveness. Sensation returns slowly. Emotion follows without urgency. Life begins to feel less guarded and more inhabited. This return is subtle. There may still be moments of withdrawal, old reflexes reappearing under stress, but they are recognized sooner. They pass more gently. Survival is no longer mistaken for identity. It becomes a chapter rather than a definition. The documentary does not end with instruction because none is required. It closes at a threshold where recognition replaces effort. Perhaps the sense of being stuck was never evidence of failure. Perhaps it was evidence of endurance. And perhaps endurance, once honored, no longer needs to dominate the future. What remains is not certainty, but space. It is no longer about returning to previous levels of functioning. It becomes quieter and more precise. What no longer fits? What is being held together that no longer needs to be? This threshold marks a significant psychological passage, not a solution, and not yet a new identity. simply an opening. And openings rarely arrive with comfort. They arrive with uncertainty. But it is through these openings that life regains movement, not by erasing what came before, but by allowing it to loosen its grip. When survival stops working, it is often because living is beginning to ask for more room. Freedom is often imagined as relief, as ease, as the absence of constraint. Yet this understanding rarely holds up under closer examination. Epictetus saw this clearly. For him, freedom did not begin when circumstances became favorable, but when responsibility was reclaimed, not for what had happened, but for how one now chooses to relate to it. Survival mode limits choice in order to preserve life. It narrows attention, reduces options, and prioritizes safety over truth. This is not a moral failure. It is a functional response. But awakening begins when choice slowly returns. And with choice comes responsibility. Not blame, not self-judgment. Responsibility in this sense is quieter. It is the recognition that while certain responses were once necessary, continuing them indefinitely is no longer automatic. It becomes something that can be noticed,